Okay, we are recording. I am Brandon Polite, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, and I'm joined by Rebecca Wallbank, who is currently a lecturer in philosophy at Uppsala University in Uppsala, Sweden. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, yeah, thanks. It's great to be here.
Awesome. So you've done a lot of research on aesthetic testimony, right? And uh, the issue there is, this question of whether other people's aesthetic judgments can form the basis of our own judgments about the thing, right? And whatever that thing may be, whether it's a movie or, a particular dish, served at a particular restaurant, whatever, right? And most philosophers working on this problem think the answer is clearly no, right? In order to, make an aesthetic judgment about a particular object, we need to have had first person acquaintance with that thing. And so, just as a way to get started, could you briefly talk us through the argument in support of that position?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting one. It seems that, we defer to testimony all the time on most things, right? Before we get dressed in the morning, we'll have deferred to somebody's testimony about the weather and we'll have deferred to testimony about, what cereal to eat. We'll have trusted other people's judgments and all sorts of things. But it seems that for certain things, particularly aesthetic judgments, we're a little bit resistant to deferring to their judgment. So would be resistant to forming beliefs, resistant to the idea that we can attain knowledge. And for most people, this is just a kind of intuitive kind of unease. And then the philosophical work comes in and trying to explain these intuitions. And so you might want to ask yourselves whether or not these intuitions are kind of valid, whether or not we should appeal to these intuitions in the first place, and whether or not they point to anything that's actually there. Because we might often talk about how people have these intuitions, but who exactly has these intuitions? And there's been some good work on this by kind of Aaron Meskin, amongst others, to do some empirical investigations as to whether or not there is this sense of unease. And on the whole there is, but it's not always clear that what the unease is is derived from is a kind of unease about the ability to form beliefs, the ability to attain knowledge, or if it's just general kind of skepticism about appealing to testimony without firsthand judgment on the whole. So there's a kind of lot to unpack, but on the whole, people are kind of worried that we shouldn't make value judgments. We shouldn't form judgments about aesthetic testimony. We shouldn't form judgments about aesthetic value without having first-hand acquaintance, without having seen it for ourselves. And there are various different ways in which you might hash this out. So you might be skeptical about the value of deference to aesthetic testimony because you think that, there just aren't any truths. The whole project is futile. Of course, there's going to be no value in deferring to aesthetic testimony because there is no aesthetic truth, there's no falsity. It's a wholly futile project. And you might think that, even if we can improve our epistemic standing and it's not entirely futile to defer to aesthetic testimony, we still can't do so in a way that is particularly beneficial. So you might think that we can improve our epistemic standing, we just can't do it very well compared to other domains. And then the third way in which you might launch a response or kind of launch a critique to deferring to aesthetic testimony is to say that look, we can form aesthetic beliefs and knowledge, and we can improve our epistemic standing. We can even do it kind of well compared to other domains, but we just ought not do it. And we ought not do it on the basis of various reasons, typically aesthetic reasons. And so there's a whole host of kind of troubles that arise with deference to aesthetic testimony. But the most common means of starting to talk about all of these is the focus on the idea that there's just something peculiar about aesthetic belief and aesthetic knowledge, which requires acquaintance. The idea is that we that aesthetic beliefs are unique, or at least unusual, in requiring some kind of access, some kind of first-hand access to the object in question. So yeah, this is kind of influenced by the Sibley, the Sibleyan idea that we need to like have felt the frenzy of the music or seen the grace and the unity. We need to really kind of you know, been there, done that, feel the power of the novel or whatever it is. We need to have done it for ourselves in order to truly make that judgment. So the idea is that, yeah, aesthetic belief or knowledge is something that requires this unique kind of access in a way that is unusual. And this explains why, yeah, sure, we're happy to defer to testimony about the health of our breakfast cereal and the weather, but there's something special about the aesthetic domain. And so that's the kind of key question here. Is there something special, or is there not?
Yeah, right. And as you just pointed out, the basic intuition underlying the whole, skepticism toward deferring to other people's judgments is precisely, it seems weird for me to say, I don't know, the Beatles' Abbey Road is a good album. I've never heard it, but it's a great album, right? That just seems really peculiar, right? As opposed to, it doesn't sound peculiar to say the cereal is healthy. I believe it. I've done no research in, nutrition, or, I haven't actually, I've read the label and, ooh, magnesium and niacin. That sounds fantastic. I have no idea what those things mean, but they say they're good for me. And so I believe it. Right. And so, yeah, there really is a peculiarity there that's sort of motivating this line of reasoning.
Exactly. So the idea is that if you do form, if you were to tell somebody, oh yeah, that's beautiful, but we hadn't experienced it firsthand, we'd have to like add qualifiers, and we'd have to like explain those certain conditions, like, oh, according to Peter, it's beautiful, or I've heard it's beautiful, but I've never seen it, or you'd have to kind of explain that your status is kind of is kind of is somewhat hindered, and that you can't really have legitimate access to the thing in question. So you have to hedge your judgment a little bit. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see whether or not these are just kind of like social conventions. Is it just a linguistic convention? We're trying to explain ourselves in a way that just kind of reflects a social practice, or does it kind of point to something deeper?
Yeah, right. And so again, most people working on this topic think that, okay, you can't defer to other people's testimony. That's not a legitimate basis for your own aesthetic judgments about whatever. And so I guess the next question is, well, what does it exactly mean to be acquainted with something, right?
Yeah.
That what's involved in experiencing that thing in a way such that we can, think that, oh, your judgment is a sound one, or your judgment at least is a plausible one, that I watched the movie, while I was, half asleep, right? Like that doesn't seem an adequate encounter. Or I read the novel while I was distracted on a flight with, crying babies or whatever. Like that doesn't seem to be an adequate encounter with the object. And so what then is entailed by, or what's necessary for you to have an acquaintance with the object such that, oh, that's a legitimate judgment that we should have confidence in?
Yeah. So I mean, it's a really good question, Chris. I think the concept of acquaintance hasn't really been fully spelled out, and so traditionally people thought what was required was first-hand perception of the object in question. So we need to have experienced it with our senses in order to form the belief, or to judge that it's beautiful, or whatever aesthetic quality we've been ascribing to it. But this is problematic for several reasons. Not all aesthetic qualities are perceptual, and not all aesthetic objects are perceptual. We have conceptual artworks, for example, in which the artwork seems to be the idea, And so obviously there's kind of questions as to whether or not this is genuinely aesthetic. But if you do think it is aesthetic, then it can't be the case that that the senses are particularly important to gaining acquaintance with it. And note that there are other people who might have, so it seems there are other reasons they might think that perception isn't all that important. So Beethoven was deaf when he was composing a lot of his musical works, but it seems problematic for us to say that Beethoven couldn't truly form an aesthetic belief or aesthetic judgment about his works because he hadn't kind of sensorily perceived them in the relevant way. I think that would be worrying. So there are various different reasons to kind of push the concept of acquaintance and see what's actually entailed. And I think most philosophers are happy to move away from that kind of sensory perception and accommodate kind of mental imagery in order to accommodate the Beethoven case. And I think people are also quite happy to, on the whole, accept the idea that we might have to accommodate surrogates as suitable for our ability to form aesthetic judgments. So, for example, a photograph, or a high quality photograph in particular, might be appropriate enough for us to form an aesthetic judgment about a painting or another photograph or something that can be, visually accessed. But then it's interesting because then we open the door to further questions like how far can we go? Must we stick to the same sensory modalities? So, for example, I saw The Kiss in Vienna, Klimt's The Kiss, and it was really cool, beautiful, if you trust my testimony. But next to it, there was a model. It was a kind of tactile model of the artwork. And I guess it was to support the experience of the visually impaired. And it was awesome. Like you could really notice so much more detail and dimensions by engaging with this tactile model. And so I can't help but wonder if you combine very detailed description or very detailed testimony of that work with a model. Would that be sufficient for acquaintance? I think if you start to open the door to broadening the notion of acquaintance, then maybe some testimony supplemented with some other things can slip in there. And it's not all clear that we have to reject it straight off the bat. So yeah, I think this all kind of like puts a lot of pressure into like, why should we care about acquaintance in the first place? And I think some people think that we need acquaintance because aesthetic judgments are so particular. So it seems to be that we can't identify any like law-like connection between any set of non-aesthetic qualities to any aesthetic qualities. We need to recognize that each instance of an aesthetic property might be uniquely manifested on the basis of certain kind of very, very specific non-aesthetic qualities. And the slightest change to the non-aesthetic qualities might have a whole different impact aesthetically. So for these reasons, people think that it's just important to have acquaintance with the first hand because of the kind of fine grainness, because of the minuteness of the detail, it makes trust harder because it's not clear that everybody's really identified all of their aesthetic properties correctly. But I think, that's that's a plausible argument. I think there's also kind of reason to push back. So so it's true that aesthetic qualities might be uniquely manifested in each instance, but this doesn't necessarily mean that we can't really understand the concepts that are described by testimony. It doesn't mean that we can't really grasp what's been uttered. It just means that we can't grasp how those qualities have been instantiated in that particular instance. We can still understand, what's been asserted. So, I can understand if you to tell me that you've just bought a new chair, and I can understand that you've bought a new chair without having to hear any particular details about what it's made of. I need to know how many legs it has, if it's made of wood. I can form that belief. And so I think similarly, I can form a belief about something being beautiful without needing to know all the particulars. I think more needs to be said, really, to explain why there'd be a distinction there, because that's just how ordinarily we engage with the world. we can understand what's being asserted without knowing the particularities, typically.
Yeah, right. And so, a couple of other reasons I think to be skeptical about acquaintance is, well, in certain cases, the more acquainted we become with a work of art, the more we like it, right? The more value we find in it, right? Which, if we liked it to begin with, then that reaffirms our initial judgment, right? Or conversely, you enjoy something the first time, and then you engage with it again, you watch the movie again, or you listen to the album again, or whatever, and it doesn't work the second time. And so you're in a state of confusion, right? Well, I had this one acquaintance, this one experience with it that was really positive, and now I have this other one that's negative, and I'm puzzled about this. So I engage with it again, and my view of it changes, right? So that's one reason. And then the other one is, well, what is entailed by being fully acquainted with the thing such that you can make a good judgment is, this point that Tina Nguyen makes in his book Games Agency is Art, which is, with some works of art, it seems like we need a lot of engagement with it, right? That if you're playing a video game using, following just one storyline, say it has multiple storylines, like, have you adequately engaged with the game? Well, no, you've engaged with one storyline, but there are other ways you could go. And I feel like the same thing is true of albums and movies, right? That, if you're a movie critic, you watch the movie once, you write your review, and then you move on to the next one, right? Well, it may have been an off night for you, right? Maybe the theater wasn't the best experience for you, right? I've had plenty of times where, the particular movie theater I saw the movie in was not adequate, and I did not enjoy it. And then later I watch it elsewhere, and it's hyper enjoyable, right? And so it seems like, that's a problem for thinking that, acquaintance is all we need, right? Well, it feels like we need more than just, I've experienced it, right?
Yeah. No, that's a really interesting point. So I guess a lot of the concerns about acquaintance relate to, what kind of acquaintance do we need? What kind of acquaintance is sufficient? What you're highlighting is that we also need to ask, how much acquaintance is sufficient? And that questions be left quite open. I do think the person who thinks that acquaintance is necessary would be deterred by the idea that we often change our mind. Maybe they'll just be reinforced in their opinion that we just need a lot of acquaintance. Maybe it does just take time. But then I think that needs to be kind of specified. And how much time? Will we ever be truly acquainted with the artwork? It's not always clear, given how much we change our minds. But perhaps after a certain amount of time, perhaps there's no fixed cutoff, and it depends on the person and the artwork in question. There's nothing more that we can really gain from our experience of it, and our judgment will become fixed. Maybe then it's sufficient. But yeah, I think these are really interesting questions that need to be spelled out more.
Yeah, right. And you just put it in a really helpful way, I think, which is this idea that our judgments are things that need to be fixed, right? And when I talked recently with Nick Riggle, when I interviewed him last, and related to my interview with Benson Ane, right, that neither of them think of aesthetic judgment as being like these final verdicts on the value of a thing, right? Which is, how, so much of, the history of aesthetics from, Kant forward has conceived of judgment as like these quasi legal verdicts of, good, bad, right? Ugly, beautiful. And it doesn't seem like judgments are like that, right? They're sort of these temporary things that come with all sorts of caveats that change and evolve and develop as we ourselves change and evolve and develop.
Yeah, no, it's really true. I guess maybe the person who thinks that acquaintance is necessary would maybe, I don't know why I'm defending that person, because I don't actually support that, but I guess maybe they'd just be happy to accept that, our judgments can change, but either way, we still need at least some acquaintance in order to make that initial judgment. Even if it changes later, we still at least need to have access to it in a certain way, and precisely what way is still a little bit unclear. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. So let's then talk about deferring to other people's judgments, right? Why might we sometimes want to defer to someone else's judgment, about the value of a thing or about its aesthetic properties, when we ourselves have not experienced it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and most people think that we ought not, and it isn't valuable for us to defer to aesthetic testimony. And they do this on the basis of various reasons. Some people think that it hinders our epistemic or aesthetic development, so that it hinders our opportunities to develop our aesthetic faculties. This is the kind of idea that's outlined by Madeline Ransom. So it's similar to like giving a calculator to a child to help solve a math problem, rather than letting them like work it out for themselves and like develop their sensibilities, develop their capacities to forming judgments in the future. So it's a hindrance to many. But I mean, I think this is kind of like not always the case, right? So I think often actually deference to aesthetic testimony is this epistemic facilitator. So Andrew Reisner and I have a paper which describes trust in aesthetic testimony as this launchpad, this opportunity for us to engage in an investigation on certain things that we wouldn't ordinarily have access to. So yes, it might entail that we accept various falsehoods, and surely that would be an epistemic bad. But in the long run, it might actually give us access to further aesthetic and epistemic truths, because we have put ourselves in a position to try and, try and form new beliefs. And from there, we can work it out. So it kind of expands our horizons, really, gives us opportunity for, further belief formation. So that's one reason why I think deference to aesthetic testimony is valuable. It really just helps kind of like move us forward. In fact, I think it might even be necessary if you think ourselves, if you think we're particularly aesthetically naive or clueless, we might have all of these like dissenting voices around us. We don't know who to trust. Just trusting somebody can just really like get the ball rolling. And I think that'd be, often more helpful than just like refusing to engage in the matter in the first place. So yeah, that's one reason why I think deference to aesthetic testimony is valuable. So people think it's disvaluable because it will be a hindrance to our ability to be authentic, or it'll be a hindrance to our ability to develop or express our aesthetic personalities. And I think this is another interesting line, but again, I want to resist it, because I think whom we choose to trust is also a reflection of our personalities, and it comes authentically from ourselves. We don't trust just anybody. We trust those who we think we want to belong to, and whom we whom we respect, and we want to kind of like share values with, whom we want to kind of engage with. And so yeah, I think this is a full reflection of our personalities. It's just a different kind of reflection of ourselves. So I just think so I think that line of attack also doesn't quite hit the mark either. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I mean, there is, of course, a problem with someone all of whose judgments are just based on other people's, right? Like a really extreme case where, all of my beliefs about movies come from Roger Ebert or some, particular set of critics. That's clearly a problem case. That's an extreme case. But, for most of us, most of the time, right, we're not engaging in that way, right? Yeah. And so I guess, a couple of things. One, I definitely want to get to the question of trust, because I think that's really helpful and interesting here. But I think before that, it's just worth mentioning that, it does seem like a lot of the problem with deferring to other people's judgments precisely comes from the idea that, well, judgments are these fixed final verdicts, right? Where, yeah, that would be a problem. But as you were describing it, actually the process is, okay, I'm deferring to this judgment, which means I'm sort of taking their attitude on board, and maybe I test it out for myself, right? Or, it prompts me to engage with, the object in a deeper way, or come at it at a different angle, or at the very least, like, it leads me to pursue my own aesthetic interests. And so rather than being like this hindrance that um uh, uh, uh restricts our autonomy and prevents us from developing our individuality, it can actually be a prompt for both of those things.
Yeah, and I think you can do that whilst genuinely deferring, whilst genuinely forming a belief. You don't have to suspend judgment on the matter. You're truly engaging with it and forming a belief about whatever it is on the basis of testimony. And yeah, it seems like it's a helpful, or at least it can be epistemically helpful and aesthetically helpful, I guess, by extension. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. And so, could we talk about when deferring to others' judgments goes wrong? Right. I mean, I brought up the extreme case of someone who makes no judgments of their own. Right. It's just, oh, Roger Ebert said, this movie is great. It's a great movie. I've never seen it. I don't want to see it. I just have this list of judgments. Right. Like, ooh, look at me. Aren't I cool? Right. Like, okay, that's not a real person. We can set them aside. Right.
Yeah.
But you mentioned trust, and I think trust is absolutely essential here. And there are plenty of times when someone has recommended something to me, and this is someone I trust, right? They have expertise, they have background, they know me, they know what my taste and what my preferences are. And so I will, watch the movie or listen to the album, or, read the novel based on, their judgment about it. And it turns out they were wrong, right? That they thought it was awesome. They thought I would think the same. And it's okay. Not awesome, but okay. Or, wow, this person doesn't know me at all. This is terrible. Right. And of course, the opposite can be
Yeah.
true, right? Where someone says, oh, I absolutely hate it. You would hate it. Don't engage with it. And so I trust them and don't, listen to the album or watch the movie. And then years later, I listen to it or I watch the movie, and then I love it. And I think, wow, all these years went by where I could have been thinking about this movie or thinking about or listening to this album, and I wasted them because I trusted this person, right? Who maybe I had really good reason to trust, right? And so, what do you make of those sorts of cases, and how should we navigate them?
Yeah, I mean, I really love this. It's a really interesting question. And yes, you're absolutely right. So the question is like, why should we trust anyone else's judgments above our own? Why should we trust anyone's right in the first place? Why should we think that they have similar sensibility to us? What if it goes wrong in all of the ways that you're describing? And I mean, so I just want to kind of like put all my cards on the table and just kind of portray myself as something as like a bit of a skeptic, right? So I think, yeah, we struggle to have good reason to trust somebody else's judgment, but we also have, we struggle to have good reason to trust our own judgment. So given the absence of rules and principles in the aesthetic domain, we can't really use logic to reason to a conclusion. We can't appeal to deductive inferences. It's extremely difficult to trust the aesthetic judgments of other people, given that we can't independently verify them. But I mean, that also applies to ourselves. And all of these issues are heightened by the prevalence of posturing and snobbery, these kind of institutional standards, and this attempt to respect the institution. So yeah, I think it's a problem that goes both ways. We can only examine the judgments of others in relation to the standards of taste that we bring to the situation ourselves. So we can only assess their aesthetic sensibility by seeing whether or not, it tallies with our own experience. But yeah, why should we trust our own experience? Why should we think that the aesthetic faculties that we have are accurate or appropriate? Why should we think that we're not biased by, implicit respect for institution or, snobbery? We don't have good reasons to trust others, really, but we don't really have good reasons to trust ourselves. And this is particularly problematic because, yeah, we just can't independently verify these judgments by appeal to deductive inferences. So I think if we were to find ourselves in that position within a different domain, I think ordinarily in that situation we'd be pretty worried. And we might even suspend judgment on the matter altogether. We just don't know. We just don't know what the basis of these judgments are. We can't verify them. We can't tell whether or not they reflect any standard. We don't know whether they reflect truth. We don't even know if there is a truth. So we should be extremely worried. But we tend not to be, right? Some people are quite confident in their own judgment. Some people are quite confident in the judgments of others. So I think it's really interesting to see that what's going on here is something non-evidential. We're so non-evidentially motivated, and we're resistant to evidence. We're resistant to the evidence that we lack evidence. And I think it's just really fascinating. So I think what we're doing is really, we're motivated by practical reasons. We're motivated by social reasons. We're just trying to belong with others. I think we desire to share with others, feel seen, feel heard, and just kind of, have this sense of belonging. And I think that, I mean, to me, that can be the only explanation for our behavior. We're not motivated by evidence, we're only motivated by this social desire. And so I think you might have two responses to this. You might think, yeah, but do we really care about other people's judgments? Do we really want to belong to this community? Do we really want to belong with others? Don't we actually just want to be like individuals? Don't we want to always resist the mainstream? Isn't the mainstream kind of, often kind of like, don't we roll our eyes at it? And I think, yes, some people do, but I think even those people are trying to belong to the group that resist the main group. And so I think we're still trying to belong. We still want to share our aesthetic experiences. We still want to kind of belong with certain others, just not the masses. So I still think there's a kind of like this group desire going on. And then another thing you might be worried about when I start talking about all of these social benefits for aesthetic deference to aesthetic testimony is like, well, that's all beside the point, because what I'm talking about is irrespective to the aesthetic benefits, right? You might think, well, okay, it's very good to have these social reasons, but these are not the aesthetic reasons that we're interested in. And then I think, again, that needs to be questioned. It's I think there's a really interesting connection that lots of contemporary philosophers are now talking about, is this connection between social value and aesthetic value. And they do seem somewhat intimately connected. I do struggle to see this, a situation in which there's something that we value aesthetically without wanting to value it with others and without others wanting to share with us. I think this is a kind of Kantian idea, right? When you make an aesthetic judgment, part of the normative force that we, that is derived is in virtue of wanting others to kind of share in our judgment. And so this kind of reflects kind of Riggle's thought as well, and a few others. So that's where I stand on that. I think actually deference to aesthetic testimony is really, really cool, because it kind of like it's a way in which we kind of like find ourselves, and it's a way in which we kind of find ourselves amongst others. And so I think it's a shame that it's typically kind of downplayed in amongst philosophers. I think there's a lot of value, and perhaps even aesthetic value maybe to it. Yeah
I love the direction you've gone with this, and I think it's exactly the right way to go. And I love the point that you made about how the skeptical objection I gave was about trusting other people, and then you turn that inward, right? Well, how can we trust ourselves? And everybody watching this, right, looks back on some period in their life and think, wow, I really thought that haircut was awesome, or I really thought that particular style of clothing was awesome, or I really love that TV show, and now you think that's embarrassing, right? And so to what extent can we trust ourselves? And I think what your argument's leading to is precisely this idea that well, we can't fully trust ourselves and we shouldn't fully trust other people. And so actually, this is a project where we need to rely on each other, right? Just
Yeah.
like in every worthwhile endeavor, it's not a solo effort, right? That determining aesthetic value is not something that we just do on ourselves. And it's not also the full-on Kantian thing where my judgment is meant to be this universal thing where I'm judging for all humanity, right? It's just, hey, these people I like who similarly like the sorts of things I like, we're kind of judging together, right? And we're relying
Mm.
on each other's judgments and their beliefs and attitudes and preferences and experiences. And we're like building up this I don't know what to call it, like a storehouse or catalog of like value, which is like a system of value that we share together, which is this evolving thing that's a process, not this like fixed final thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's really interesting. I Yeah, I mean, maybe, yeah, maybe it is this kind of like fluid and kind of like socially dependent thing. I don't know. I mean, but I do want to, yeah, I haven't quite worked out like how connected I think social value is to aesthetic value, but I do think that I really struggle to have the aesthetic value without others and without trying to see ourselves in relation to others. It seems, yeah, it seems to pull others in, and I'm not sure exactly how many others, if it's just if it is universally directed or just kind of locally, but I think maybe that reflects the differences between like artistic values and aesthetic values perhaps, and maybe the different kinds of values even within them. So yeah, I don't know, but I want to know more. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. So I think on that note, we'll wrap things up. So Rebecca, thank you so much for joining me. This was a really fantastic talk on a subject that I really love to think about.
Yeah, thanks. It's been really fun. Yeah.
Awesome.